Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Only a Bag, the Italy travel podcast. I'm Darcy Melton.
And I'm Nathaniel Mellor. We recently changed that from an Italian travel podcast to an Italy travel podcast.
I think that's what
or
it is.
Or an Italian travel guide to an Italy travel podcast. So we are still both learning how to say it because we changed it for SEO/algorithm reasons. And we are both so not caught up, but it's such muscle memory to say in a guide to Italian travel that an Italian travel podcast does not roll off the tongue nearly as easily.
No, this is at least take 4 of me messing it up.
And what are we going to be talking about today?
We're going to be talking about the €1 house phenomenon.
Bum, bum, bum. Can you actually buy a house for €1 in Italy? Stay tuned to find out more. I don't know. I want to sound like the 6 o'clock nightly news.
Yeah, but we don't have ads, so
we really
stay tuned. And we're back.
And we're here.
But first, some local news.
I love that we're staying with this.
Take it away.
Interestingly, close to where we live, and when I say close, I do mean, 100 meters away.
I'm pretty sure we can see it out of our window.
Yeah, so maybe
I'm looking at it right now.
200 or 300 meters away. There is a construction site, and on this construction site, they discovered a necropolis, a group of tombs with pottery and bronze coins and bronze ware, as well as some belt made with bronze and leather, which was fascinating that they thought that was interesting enough to make its own thing. One of these articles said that the clay pottery they found was from like some Greek clay pottery. It was like a known thing. It was like, oh, that's the so-and-so pottery. So I don't know if that's a style or if that's like a workshop out of Greece at the time, but it dates back to 400 BC. So it's very old for even this valley, which this valley that we live in was really not ever on a map for anybody's map. Like I think the Romans briefly were here. One of the roads that ended up being the Appian Way or the Via Appia passes through this valley, but it's like, yeah, you don't really know it's here. It's a little hidden valley. So it's fascinating. There's a necropolis, but what's interesting is not the fact it was discovered. It's interesting because it was discovered about a year ago, and the construction company / owners decided not to tell anybody, dating back to that fun old joke that everyone's, terrified if the Guardia di Finanza shows up, but everyone's really afraid of the archaeological Guardia di Archeologo coming up, because it basically means you can no longer do any construction because it's amazing to save things. And I think a lot of people are also afraid that by calling in the proper authorities, you're never going to build that house type thing.
Yeah, it essentially halts all of your work for the foreseeable future.
Exactly. So they didn't want to call anybody. They didn't want to call it in. And I think it was a mixture of stealing and destroying and hiding this, that when somebody finally did discover it and let the authorities know, we are all kind of excited because it has led to some serious repercussions in terms of...
It's spicy.
It is very, especially for a small valley, which is essentially like a small town. So everybody knows about it and everybody's talking about it and everyone's saying, oh, did you hear? They were stripped of their licenses to work. They can't do this. They're being fined. And it's exciting because while obviously everybody wants, them to build their third or fourth house down there, or whatever it's going to be, we're in an area that has a lot of, again, while the fact it's a very undiscovered part of Italy, I would say, like undiscovered in the sense of nobody knows where this area is.
Mm-hmm.
But
other Italians don't know where this area is.
Yes, that's a great way to know. Either other Italians are like, where do you live? And so it's great though when they do discover things, because sometimes there have been finds that are fascinating, but there's simply no money because a lot of obviously the archaeological money would be tied up in Rome, or we talked about in one episode, Pompeii is still being undiscovered. I think a week and a half ago, they just discovered a thermal bath it was like a beautifully decorated thermal bath.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
And it was supposed to basically be for the wealthy. Essentially, I think it was not necessarily a bath for the wealthy, but for those of you who are trying to curry favor with the wealthy, you take them to these baths. But I think
you're rubbing elbows.
Oh
in
yeah,
the bath. You
are. I mean, little naked elbows in the bath. I guess that's where business gets done, I've been told. And I think that Pompeii, as we discovered in some previous episodes, is only about 40% uncovered / discovered. The rest of it is still buried and only hinted at what's underneath. So yes, unfortunately, a lot of the archaeological money is not in small areas like where we live. However, it's still fun news to know that we do actually live in a place that at one point in time, civilization did occur. And
I think there's several spots around the valley where we are, where they have found, what are they called?
Artifacts? Or
yes, thank you. Where people have found artifacts, but things are often covered up. They're not reported to the proper authorities, and they're, I don't want to say pillaged, but people do take bits of it, or they have been reported to the proper authorities, but like you said, because there's just not the availability of archaeologists perhaps or funding, they're never really discovered or uncovered or anything like that. So they just are existing beneath the earth or in caves or something, but we don't know more about them because there's not access to people, doing the right work.
And I think that just as a last little note is because I think as an American, this seems wild to me. Just like, oh yeah, in your basement, there might be a necropolis dating back 2,000 years. And it seems insane to me. However, one of the architects we know has mentioned that sometimes on a construction site, you will find urns and things. And that's all it is. It doesn't lead to something else. It's just at some point they buried urns, and whether it's unfortunately not always with money, it's usually like maybe it was just for storage, or maybe it was just for, it was trashed, the urn broke, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not always that when you find something that it's a sign of a larger site or settlement. It's sometimes just trash that somebody buried. And then now there's a fear if I call the archaeological surveyors, they're going to come out, they're going to pause their work. Who knows when they're going to get around to actually doing the surveying? It could just be years before I can get back into doing this.
It's a real shame because I feel like there's a plethora of items and places and sites that could be discovered, but they just aren't. And that's a bummer. And
Absolutely.
It's a bummer that people feel like they have to break the law and cover these things up.
100%. Which brings us kind of really nicely into today's episode. As we talked about before, can you buy a €1 house? And in buying said house, are you going to discover a lost town or civilization underneath the basement? You might be.
Perhaps.
I'm really leaning to the 6 o'clock nightly news, sort of, and a dog that can play the piano.
Yeah.
They always have the one fun thing to end the news. You're
They
looking
do,
at me
yeah.
like you have not seen the 6 o'clock nightly news. And before we get into that, just as a last little thank you, not as a last little thank you, a very big thank you, but as a last little note before we jump into today's episode, thank you seriously so much to everyone who has been listening, who have, in the last week or two, we actually got a number of followers, I think like 20 followers or something, which is a lot for us.
Which 20 followers?
I think so in the last 7 days.
Oh my goodness. Hey, y'all.
Thank you all so much. We genuinely appreciate it. It does warm our hearts to know that we are hopefully not even just like making a difference, but just, I know that for some of you, it's a bit of a fantasy, like, in terms of like, oh, I'd like to live in Italy one day. This is just fun. And for some of you, it's, researching what to do when you actually come to Italy and traveling in Italy. And we're just happy to be part of that. So we really do appreciate you all listening and enjoying the podcast alongside with us, because it's a lot of fun to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening.
And if you'd like to follow us, you can absolutely do so. Spotify and Apple Podcasts, you can follow us there. We have an Instagram at onlyabagpodcast. We also have an email address if you have any questions, comments, concerns at onlyabagpodcast@gmail.com. Actually, it's not at onlyabagpodcast. It is onlyabagpodcast. It's a very normal email address. And we have a website, onlybag.com, that will soon be updated. We just wanted to take a picture of us doing the podcast for proof, because we've been using a lot of stock images, and at a certain point, stock images just kind of start to make the website look like it's not real.
Mm-hmm. We do try to use as many of our own images as possible, but, we're not the best photographers. So sometimes it's just a junky looking photo, which isn't exciting. So
Well, I think
we use better photos sometimes.
And it's like if we take a picture of the Coliseum, and then it's like, okay, that's a picture of the Coliseum. It's nice. It's at night. It's beautiful. It's lit up, but it's not like a great photo.
Mm-hmm. It's a little grainy because it was taken with not
iPhone.
the best camera or a phone. Yeah.
From 9 years ago. But then it's like you see somebody else's photo and you're like, oh, yeah, I'll use that one so people know what I'm talking about. So it's a little bit like that, especially because some of these photos do get blown up in terms of size. So with that being said, that website will be live very soon, and it's going to be a little bit more updated, just to make it easier to find information, save things like that. So let's hop into it. Darcy, please tell me if it's possible to buy a house for €1 in Italy. Just rip the Band-Aid off, yes or no?
Yes. And it's not going to be €1.
Heartbroken. I'm shattered. And I think that's the end of this episode. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. So, okay. It is possible to buy a house that is participating in the €1 project in Italy. However, there are many other fees and things that go along with it. One of the big sort of Band-Aids to rip off, I guess, is that often these houses are at auction and they will start at €1 and go up from there.
And because that sounds interesting, what is the €1 house project you mentioned a second ago?
Hey, Nathaniel, why don't you take it away and tell us what the €1 project in Italy is?
I'd love to. Well, The One Year House project is essentially, and it seems to be quite localized to Italy in the sense that I think some other countries have started it afterwards, but it looks like it started in Italy.
They were trendsetters, Italy.
I think they were. I don't know if Sambuca di Sicilia, which is a town in Sicily called Sambuca di Sicilia, sort of near Agrigento. I don't know if they started this.
They didn't. They were one of the
Okay.
first, but they really popped off because they got popular because a woman from Chicago, an American woman from Chicago, bought a house in Sambuca
That's what I
di
thought.
Sicilia,
Okay.
and her story was, in the news everywhere. And she also, I think, posted a lot of her updates and renovations and
makes sense.
such
That
on
makes sense.
TikTok and Instagram, and so she really blew up that whole
The
spot.
spot, because they also have just as a point of interest, they also have a youth group, and I say youth here, that does mean under 40, that
I love that.
I know, right, that is part of the €1 house project, in terms of they're the ones who, when you want to give up your family house or something like that for the cause, they're the ones you kind of contact with, and they do try to connect you. Yeah.
This is a group specific to Sambuca di
So,
Sicilia?
yeah.
Okay, got it.
And the big push behind all of these houses is essentially, let's repopulate these small, old, dying towns. And that's really all there is to it. That's the idea. From there, it does change a little bit in the sense of, and as you might mention later, some of these mayors aren't really that concerned if you want to live there that long. If they're just like, if you just want to come for like a week, that's fine. If you want to rent it out, who cares? And that's not what most of them are about.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are about, we would really like you to come here to renovate a house and then to live here. And while some of the houses of this €1 project are essentially a husk of a house in terms of it is maybe a roof, maybe
It's got some walls.
it has walls. I think that's usually, a lot of them are just walls. And I say that because the flooring was logs that have either rotted away, or the not the termites, the
Tarly.
the woodworms, I guess.
Yeah, I think they're woodworms.
They've eaten them away. And then the roof, unfortunately, same thing. It's shingles laid on top of wood. So if the wood is rotten away, then you lose your roof. However, the walls are, a meter thick stone walls. So they're not going anywhere. Even in an earthquake, you're fine. And you also might have heard of Sambuca di Sicilia because back in 2019, I believe it was, Airbnb also bought one of these houses and renovated it. And for a time, and I don't know if they're still doing it, but there was a competition to enter. You would live in this house for free, and you would split the money. You would have to rent out part of it as an Airbnb, and you'd split the money with Airbnb. So essentially what they're offering you is a free place to stay and a partial income for the year, which I thought was an interesting project, except as we've talked about in that episode, it was specific to Venice, but like, is Airbnb a problem? It was kind of a resounding yes.
Yes, it definitely is.
So maybe you don't want to be part of the project, but yeah, to answer, you mentioned earlier just a second ago, that's what this idea of the €1 house project, essentially what it is a push, an endeavor, a project to repopulate old towns that might not normally be on the map, that might not normally be populated, especially because some places like Tuscany have no issue repopulating small towns. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's Tuscany. They keep filming movies there. But in the rest of Italy, there's a lot of issues repopulating small towns.
And there are some €1 houses that are available in Tuscany and the northern regions,
for sure.
but they are far more rare than the ones in southern Italy and Sicily and Sardinia.
Yes, where it seems kind of dime a dozen.
Mm-hmm. And there are so many small towns in Italy compared to other countries. They're just little pockets of tiny towns. They're often medieval towns. And I don't know if there are fewer in the north or if it just is more popular to live in the north, so they happen to not be as depopulated.
Yeah.
Depopulated? Is
I
that
think
a word?
so, yeah.
Or if there really are just so many of these towns in the south that there's just an overabundance.
I do wonder also, we don't know too much about this, so for me, I'm speaking completely out of turn here, but the South didn't get like super duper bombed in World War II. And I know that like even in France, there are some towns that still, they I don't think anybody lives there because they have unexploded ordnance and they're not sure like,
Oh, wow.
They're like, I think even some dating back to World War I in terms of they're like, there might be chemical weapons there that haven't exploded. We don't know where they are. Don't live there.
Wow.
And southern Italy doesn't really have that. There's not a lot of places that was bombed, that were bombed in the war.
Our town actually was accidentally bombed.
Yes. I think they either dropped a bomb too early or they mistook it for there was a military base above us. And then immediately shut down after the war. But I think by and large, the South, I mean, I think it's a mix between the fact that in the late 1800s, a lot of people left. So a lot of people left houses that were in this late 1800s condition. And then the war happened, which took a lot of, both two wars, which took a lot of people from the towns. And then it's sort of just like what you end up getting is this sort of weirdly preserved, 100-something-year-old town that is in one sense, it's kind of a clean slate, like in the sense of, and I say that, like, I know there's a lot of potentially people listening who are into preserving history, which, to be very clear, we are very much into preserving history. And when I do say clean slate, I don't mean like come in and completely destroy the houses there.
Oh, no.
It's just unfortunately some of these houses are not like, how would I with this? There's not a lot left that is original. So it's like maybe it could be a house in the late 1800s that was then renovated in like the 30s or the 20s or the 50s or 60s. And then, but they didn't renovate, like taking out it's like they took out all the good parts and they put in all the bad parts.
In some cases, yes.
It's like they took out the bread oven from 1680 and they stuck in, just a terrible chimney, and you're just like, awesome. So nothing fun in this house.
And a quick note on the structure of the houses. This is not a note on the €1 houses, but we have seen several houses for sale in our town, and they are sometimes a Frankenstein version of many houses put together, and
Absolutely.
not always in a way that makes sense. So that's just a note that these houses aren't necessarily going to be in perfect condition. They are certainly not going to be what you expect of an American house. So just keep that in mind.
Just when you say Frankenstein, just to give people a picture, we live in the middle floor of a 3-story house, essentially 3. It's technically 5 stories if you consider the attic and the what's called a deposito, but it's like wood storage on the bottom where you keep wooden animals. We live in the middle of essentially 5, but we'll just make it easy and say the middle of 3. The one above us is partially renovated in the sense of they clearly replaced some beams and they took out windows, but they didn't put windows back in. So it's a couple of giant holes leading to the outside. And then below us has not been touched since the 50s, maybe.
Maybe I think someone was probably living there in the 50s, but I don't think they did many renovations to it. So our house above the door here, people will often put the year the house was built, and ours is from the 1700s. So I think that a lot of that is currently down below, it's a bread oven and certain things like that. I would guess that's probably from the 1800s, but someone was living there probably as recently as the 50s.
I mean, there's an indoor toilet and stuff, which is pretty rare in terms of there are people who were born in the 50s who were like, no, there's no indoor toilets for most of these houses. You went outside. So that's just to give you an idea of when these houses, I think this is also good just because, and I was going to ask you a question in a second when you say like, ripping off that other Band-Aid of if it's not really €1 and they go to auction, but it is to say that sometimes you will find a house that is almost livable in the sense of in the 90s, maybe they did some renovation and then whoever was there either passed away or ended up moving and wants the tax write-off of not having to deal with this house. However, it is going to be a lot of the times a structure that is just a couple of walls and it's in town. So it makes it super easy in terms of like, you're not like out in the middle of nowhere having to figure out how to organize, electricity being run out there or a well or something. But it is not as simple as buying a ready to go turnkey house. And I think ever, I don't think it'll ever be as ready to go. It'll never be turnkey basically.
Yeah, I would agree.
So what is this? You mentioned a minute ago too about this other Band-Aid you ripped off so brutally.
Oh, I don't know. I have a list of cons.
Oh, well, yeah. Let's jump into the cons.
Okay.
Because we know the pros. The pros are you get a house.
We're
in Italy. And we're going to hit the pros up later. But I think it's good to maybe hit some realism into this of why it can't happen. And if at the end of the cons, you're like, none of those are that bad, then yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to not burst anyone's bubble. I just want to be realistic about it because I feel like as soon as this popped up and became popular, this program, there were so many people on social media making this seem like a perfect, easy dream that anybody can do. And it is possible for a lot of people, but I think it's not cool to make it seem like everything is perfect and there's no problems with it.
For sure. It's also, I think a lot of people brought it to our attention because we are known in our social circles as people with very little money. And when I say social circles, I mean, we have social circles with very little money, but they're like, oh, you guys live in Italy. You could buy a house for €1 and we can come visit. And so of course we immediately did research because we thought, wait, there's no way we live in Italy.
Also, Darcy was like, I have a euro. Yes, I'm
exactly.
going to do this.
That's coffee money. We can do that. And then we realized we could not. So let's see these cons.
Okay. So obviously, I think you mentioned this before, that these are always in small, low population towns.
Yes. Which, if I can kind of maybe add a little pro to that one real quickly, it doesn't often, it doesn't always mean that the town is in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes it's a low population town that is, like, for instance, one of them is Pignone, Pignone, which looks like pig nun, but it's Pignone. And I think it's like 30 minutes outside of La Spezia, which means it's 30 minutes outside of Cinque Terre. It's an hour and change from Genoa. It's right next to, in terms of like near the train station. They don't have one in town, but it's not like middle of nowhere. It's actually like, oh, in 30 minutes you hit one of the hottest tourist spots in Italy. So, I mean, Cinque Terre. So it isn't always middle of nowhere. It's just sometimes you're kind of, and of course some of them are 2 hours from anything resembling even a small city. So
I saw several today that were within 2 hours or an hour and a half of a major airport. So
yes.
there's one that isn't up and
Though,
running
to be fair,
yet.
we're 2 hours from a major airport.
Yes, exactly. So it's not livable. And if you have a car or are willing to rent a car, I feel like that's totally doable.
I wanted to add one other thing. It tends to be because of just, you mentioned car, and I think it's a really good point. Almost all of these you have to assume is going to be in a mountainous town.
Yes. And I believe one I think I saw had a train station.
Oh, wow. That's actually quite impressive.
I know, because most of them will not. You have to get there by car.
Yeah, or bus. And the reason I mentioned mountainous is a lot of times in a mountain town, it was built for, like our town specifically was built for either, some streets were built for this kind of cars in like the 60s, 50s. So it's tiny little, Fiats and Cinquecentos and the Citroens that, fit like a person in there. And the rest of it is built basically for donkey and cart. Mm-hmm. So you have to consider that a lot of times you probably can't drive to anywhere in the town. You can drive around the outskirts of the town, but then you park and you walk into town. And if our small little hilltop town is anything to go by, you cannot get anywhere with a flat walk. If you leave our front door, you're either going uphill or downhill, and there's no flat hill. There's no, we're just going to take a little nice walk. And I think, honestly, the only flat place in town is the piazza, which they sort of intentionally flattened. But
yes,
by and large, everywhere in town is up or down, and it makes it difficult because I think of, if you have any trouble walking, and I don't mean like serious trouble, I just mean like sometimes, your foot trips or something like that. It can be quite murderous, especially when it's raining.
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider, especially if you're someone who is of retirement age and your body just doesn't want to go uphill anymore, which is completely understandable.
Absolutely.
And on the topic of hilltop towns, something to think about is that it is very difficult for construction equipment to get to these houses. So it's possible, but it will certainly take time and potentially finagling the right truck, because some of these construction companies only have the one truck that goes up small hills, and it's definitely got to be, a 4x4. It's got to be something that can get up the hill with heavy equipment in it. So it's just a consideration if you're looking at buying a house like this.
And we've talked about that actually briefly in the Venice episode, I believe, because we talked about, like, we walked around Venice, and one thing that jumped out to us is the fact that some of these houses are dilapidated, and we're like, in Venice, how is it not worth it to repair the house? And a large part of it, we realize, is because there's no way to get there, obviously, by car. It's Venice. And there's almost no way to get there by boat or barge, because you're so far away. You're so into the interior. The only way is to essentially have some sort of cart system. And if you need beams and things, it would be, a logistical nightmare to try to figure out how to repair these houses. And that is a huge consideration, as I assume you're going to bring up next in the topic of repairs.
Yeah, let's jump into that.
Let's do it.
How about you go first?
Well, one of the cons is, and this is one of the things that almost immediately prevented us from initially wanting to buy one of these houses, is that, let's just say, for example, you were the only person to bid on this auction. You're the one who found the auction, so you got it. It's your house for €1. Afterwards, you would have to make a promise to the town to fix the house into a livable state.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes that has a time limit on it.
I was going to say, I think it often does. And a lot of times, I think if it's part of the same system, you need to basically, again, let's just say for argument's sake that you have an idea of what, hey, you want to renovate it because you need a kitchen, it needs an updated bathroom, it needs whatever, a new floor, a new roof, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say you have an idea, you have to apply for the permits, and then the work has to start within 3 months of the permits being accepted, which in Italy, permits can take, 6 months to sometimes longer if it's over the winter. So if you buy this, in October, you might not expect permits until like May. It's not a quick process. So it's kind of like one of those things where if you have money put aside for it, it's one thing. But if it's like, I'll basically pay as I go along, it doesn't really work like that. You kind of need to promise that you have all the money up front. And as a minimum, most websites and agencies and real estate agencies and towns recommend that you have 20,000 euros put aside for the construction. It will be more if you happen to choose a town that doesn't have a construction crew or team, which means they'll have to come from another town, which adds on some fun fees. Not necessarily fees from the town, just fees from the construction company from having to drive all that way with materials. And as Darcy, you just mentioned, if you have a house that you're like, it's so cute, it's right up in the middle of town, you can only walk to it, I have to drive, blah, blah, blah. If it's one of these things that's actually kind of difficult to reach, then you might not be able to find somebody to do the work on the house, which unfortunately does not mean, as far as we can tell, it means you lose the house.
And I do hope, I don't know if this is a hopeless hope, but I hope that if a house is part of this program, because this is an official program.
Exactly.
It's not just random people saying, oh, I'll sell you my house for €1. If it's a part of the program, I do hope that it would have been sort of, checked on by the city, that the city would have approved it.
Yeah.
And that construction companies.
Like verified in some way.
Exactly. And they would have looked before you buy it to see if a car can get to it with construction equipment.
Absolutely,
if it needs to be renovated. And I also hope that in these towns, again, because they're a part of the official program, that they would have construction companies that work in that town, that it wouldn't be entirely on you.
Or at least, and I think some of them do have a connection with a construction company. And that is also, arguably what makes it a little bit more difficult. We talked about this before. It was something actually you and I were going to talk about more in depth until they canceled it, was the super bonus, the eco super bonus, as well as the 110 program, which is 110% of your renovation costs were returned to you. So if you renovate, as long as you, I think you had to go up 2 energy rating levels. So if you were energy rating G and you went up to, let's just say a C, you jumped quite a few levels there, they would return 110% of your renovation costs to you. However, only a handful of construction companies could carry out that work. And not a handful in Italy, a handful in any given area. So it meant that they were pretty much like working 24/7.
And there was a wait list.
Yes,
you had to get on.
huge wait list. And there was also, it ended up being somehow too, it's like you this is Italy after all, so you don't actually like make 10% on your money. Because if you're thinking, I put 100 grand into my house and I made 110, that's amazing. The construction company would take a portion of that. So I think you left with like 90. So it's not still bad. It's still basically a 10%. You basically paid, if you're going to pay 100 grand to renovate your house, you only spent 10 grand to renovate your house.
And you do have to put up all the money ahead.
Yes.
So, and I think in order to get the money back from that program, you had to have the work completed.
Exactly.
Which is interesting because some of there are houses around town where you can see that they've done part of that project. They've insulated the outside of the house or something, but I don't know that the project was completed. So did those people actually get any money back, or they sunk all their own money in without getting a return?
And that's a good question. And that's what kind of goes back to this €1 house, because if you are on the hook for renovating, which you will be, and again, even if it's like as close as possible to a turnkey house, there might still be something like, for instance, the roof is a big one. I don't know even what it is here, every 20-ish years or so. And there's ways to redo a roof that isn't redoing a roof, in the sense of like, they'll come in and they won't necessarily replace your roof, but what they do is clean the tiles, replace the cracked tiles, or the ones that are saturated with water, or ones that have just overgrown with moss, and they'll replace any of the beams that need to be replaced, and then they'll re-put the tiles back on. That's a lot cheaper than, weirdly, even though in my mind,
it's so much work, because they're taking
so intensive.
Each tile off one by one and
to
cleaning
clean
them and inspecting them and then replacing them.
Yeah.
That's wild.
But it's somehow cheaper than just getting a new roof. And I guess materials cost more than anything else. And so there are ways, again, to keep your costs down. But unfortunately, yes, that is, I think, one of the major cons is you do have to promise that you will renovate the house. And I should just throw in out right now, you as a person can renovate some of the things, but you as a person cannot renovate everything. Some of it will have to be done by a certified electrician or plumber or roof specialist, because if you ever sold the house in the future, they would need a guarantee that it's not going to be a disaster.
And it is very different than in the US. I feel like in the US, we have Lowe's and Home Depot and Ace in your local hardware store, and you get a bit of elbow grease in there and you can, renovate your own house in a lot of ways. Obviously, you do need permits for many things in the US, but there are also a lot of things that you can do yourself. Here, it is a little bit less like that. Some things are quite complicated. There are people who are stonemasons, people who are plasterers. You have to open up the walls, which are not drywall, is what we have in the U.S.
Mostly,
so you can just kind
plaster,
of knock that out with a what's the
Sledgehammer?
hammer? Thank you. Sledgehammer, and then you call the hopefully you call it the electrician beforehand. But you can do some of that work yourself. Here, the moratore, the stone person has to come in and open up the wall for the electrician, who then has to come and replace that line. So the construction of these homes are very different, and there might be many projects that you cannot actually do yourself because you don't have the expertise in the construction of these kinds of homes.
And that's actually, if you, for those of you who like home renovation shows who are listening to this because you're like, excuse me, €1 house, I get to renovate myself. That's a dream come true. There is a TV show that I don't love to death, and it's one of those home renovation shows that usually takes place in the United States. I think somewhere in like Oklahoma or something. It's not Fixed or Fabulous, but it's something like that, right?
Mississippi?
Is it? And then it's the one day they go to Italy. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it was like, maybe not Fixed or Fabulous. It's one of those shows, and we'll put it in the description, where they go to Italy because it's like their friend in Italy asked them to help like renovate their, I think it's Tuscan farmhouse. And it's a kind of, of course, this is, let's be honest, a lot of this is scripted, but it does do a good job of showing you, like they expected, they landed, and they're like, all right, we're going to talk up some work with an architect. The architect's going to get the permits and it'll be done and we'll have the work started by whatever. And the architect's like, no, the permits aren't going to arrive until like maybe March. And I think this is October. And then they're talking about taking out this wall. And then you have the apprentice architect who's like, this wall? No, it's like 2.5 meters thick and it's holding up the house.
I have to say, I was really expecting it. I do love HGTV. I will binge HGTV. And I know that a lot of the shows, like you're saying, are scripted and or fake or something else. And so I was expecting the show to be a silly, fluffy thing where they just make this beautiful home in Tuscany. And I love that the Italians were like, no, we can't do that. What do you mean it's 6 months? No. And they were nice.
Oh, yeah. No,
but they were
very
firm.
Polite. Yes.
And I loved it.
They're like, I don't care that you're recording this on TV. We're not doing that thing. That's not happening. Not today. I'm so sorry. So if all of this is making you more excited than depressed, and you have not already seen that show, it's kind of worth watching. I don't know where you find it. HGTV.com. I don't know if there's like a streaming thing, but yes.
We'll put the name of the show in the
we will, yeah.
Description though.
It basically is all to say that, unfortunately, renovation in the States, I think, is, as you mentioned, a Home Depot, Lowe's run, and you're just, you're putting up a shelf for a wall. And even here, putting up a shelf is a nightmare.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, you don't have the drill that does the hammer thing that actually goes through stone? Well, you're not putting up a shelf. So silly. So what is the next con?
Oh, one thing I did want to mention that I don't think we did yet is that, so all of these, even though they're all part of the same program, you don't apply to the national program. You apply through the comune. We'll get into that in a minute.
Okay.
But related to construction, because they are specific to certain towns and communities, sometimes you will have to promise to, start construction and get the permits in within 6 months. Sometimes you will have to apply with a plan for your renovations ahead of time. Sometimes it will be within a month of you purchasing the home that you have to supply this plan. So just keep in mind that you can't just go at it willy-nilly necessarily. You do have to have a plan.
And as one last thing, and then we will move past this, I swear to the listeners who are just like, I'm not renovating a house, move on, is if you see, like, there's one town, I cannot remember the name of it, but there's one on the list I looked at, and they asked that you spend a minimum of €100,000 on renovation. I'm not going to say that that's a warning bell necessarily, but
it really is, though.
It is a bit of a warning bell. For me, at least, like, because even €100,000 I mentioned with a super bonus, but that's like for this eco super bonus, but that's doing all new windows and doors. That's doing a new roof. That's insulating the entire house. That's putting in new appliances. I mean, that's a lot of money.
You're either making a luxury home or you're building a whole new house with that much money.
And I think one of these people, I think in San Bucuzzi di Sicilia, it might not be the one you're talking about from Chicago, but she put about $400,000 into it.
I think it's the same person.
Okay.
She put and it looks really nice.
And it looks like she put $400,000 into it, which is great. And it's also 2 houses, not 1. She won,
okay.
I think, 1 for $4,000 and 1 for 16 or something like that. So, I mean, just to say she's renovating 2 houses, and looking at some of the photos, it was like, oh, she didn't just like choose, the cheap tile. She went for like clearly the nice handmade sort of like, okay, that's a nice tile. And that might run you, instead of €6 a square meter, that might be closer to €200 a square meter. So, there's definitely some wiggle room here, but I think you and I, anytime we see you must spend like $100,000 on renovations, it's just like there's a bit of a warning bell. And just in terms of we know people here who built their house for €100,000 from scratch, like poured concrete, everything, including the land. So when you have to put that much into a house, it makes me think that maybe there's some sort of, the mayor's cousin runs the only construction crew in town kind of thing.
And that's not to say I don't want to make people think that everything in Italy is so cheap, because sometimes it is.
Sometimes it's very much not.
Sometimes it's not. But €100,000 for a renovation is a lot.
In a small town in the middle of nowhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say, I'm pulling this number out of thin air, but 50,000
I think that's fair.
Is a good number for general renovations. If you have a massive, leak or need a whole new roof across a very wide property, or every floor has to be redone, maybe you're going above that. But I think a lot of these can be done for less than 100,000.
Yes, it should. And especially if it obviously changed. Like, again, we've talked about some of these houses that have no floors and no roof. You're probably looking at $100,000 for that minimum. But if it has a floors and it has a roof, and all you're doing is wiring, plumbing, maybe, obviously you need a new kitchen, new bathroom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe a new staircase, because, whoever put a staircase in, put it in the stupidest spot in the world. Yeah. Okay, that might be in that €70,000 range, but no new staircase, maybe 50.
But it would be weird that they require you to
pay
essentially
a certain
promise
amount. Yes.
that up front.
Yeah, especially because it's like, what if you find a house that's already in better condition?
Mm-hmm.
So
that's weird.
That is just something for those of you looking into this. Again, Idealista, which is that website we'll link, we talked about in the last episode, we'll link it below this one. It is a house buying / house renting website with a lot of information and good articles. And even they are like, 20 to 25 is like a nice base minimum, but you can also get the work done for 2025. Like, it's a minimum, but it's also not like an uncommon amount of money, if that makes sense to spend.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, since we're talking about money, should we go into some sort of, they're not hidden fees, but fees you might not think of off the top of your head?
I think, we can name this section, Why a €1 House Does Not Cost €1 in Italy.
Yeah, I like that.
Thank
I
you.
like that we have sections.
I know. Nightly news.
Okay, so there is a regular payment on top of, or there are several, I guess, payments on top of your house payment that you have to pay either to the homeowner or to the municipality, right?
Correct.
And do you remember that percentage?
It's so which one specifically?
There's one that essentially you have to pay up front as like a promise that you will buy the house.
It's typically 5 to 10% of the house, which obviously goes out the window when it's €1, or even if you get it in auction. So I think it becomes a flat rate of a couple of €1,000.
Okay, so that is something that I'm curious about that I don't think either of us have the answer for. But anytime you look up these €1 houses, there's this phrase, a symbolic price of €1. So when it comes to taxes and fees like this, like the upfront cost, I don't know if they're charging you based on that €1 or if it's the actual valuation of the home.
And there's something that I think just like in the States, the town does their own private evaluation of each and every house in the town. That's how they understand how much to charge you for your property tax or for whatever else it is. And that, I'm pretty sure, is what they go off of, because you're right. They use that €1 as a symbolic thing a lot. And I think that's what to say is, just to be clear, this house is not worth €1. This house is worth 25,000 euros or whatever, 10,000 euros. Mm-hmm. It's just, we're going to sell it to you for €1, but we're going to tax you as if it's 20,000 or 30,000 or whatever it is. And it is, to be fair, it's going to be well below market rate, whatever price the town valuates it at. It's just more, I think, a little bit more, the price of the land mixed with the price of the actual house. Like, okay, how much did it cost to make the house? It's not, they don't seem to be whims of the market too much. So you aren't paying extraordinary amounts of money, but it's more of a protection for the town. So again, this 1 euro house thing works really well for getting people in, but a lot of this is a protection to prevent, an uncle from selling their niece or nephew a 1 euro house that they can live in and then flip it. And then it's like, oh, you just made a ton of money. And it's like, well, you can't do that.
Right. And that's the next fee I want to talk about is the notaio fee. And that's another protection sort of a situation for, like you're saying, if an uncle wants to gift the house to a kid, it's not just a free house that you can keep, using and stuff like that. There is a fee for the transition from the house from one person to the next.
Yeah. So the notaio is a notary in English, and essentially they're the one who does all the paperwork. They'll do the paperwork for you, and they pay. I think it's a minimum of 1,000 euros plus 22% VAT on the value of the house that the town sets on it, or the sale cost. And it seems to be like whichever is higher, which makes sense because if you're selling this through a real estate agent or something like that, they want 22% of the sale price. But if you're selling this privately, and this is where I kind of get, when I say privately, I do mean within a family, or if it's a friend to a friend kind of thing, where you're like, let's just do a handshake deal. I'll sell you the house for, nothing, basically, just I don't want to use it anymore. The town will still be like, right, and we think it's still worth some money. So the notaio is a minimum of, let's just say, again, for ease, let's just say 1,000 euros.
Okay.
So already this 1 euro house is 1,001 euros.
Right.
And that doesn't include the few thousand euros you have to pay up front to, I believe, the town, because it's the town selling it to you, that basically that you are promising to buy the house. And as a brief note on that, because we're going to kind of get into very, very, very briefly at the end of this, just buying a house regular style, as opposed to through the town, you put this money forward, and it's essentially, I'm promising to buy the house. And it's usually a percent of the house. But again, I don't know how that works with a 1 euro house. I think it's a percent on what they say the house costs. So let's just say, for example, it's 2,000 euros is what you put down. If you decide later not to buy the house, if in a couple months you're like, I just can't keep the money together, this is not going to work, I do not need this project house in Italy, you lose the 2,000 euros. And if later the town says, you know what, we want to sell it to somebody else, we don't like you, then they actually have to double that money and give it back to you. So they have to give you 4,000 euros. And it's just these protections in place that nobody can pull out of a deal once
you can't renege, essentially.
Exactly. Once it's signed. I mean, once the contracts are kind of signed, before contract's signed, you can do whatever you want. But as soon as you sign a contract saying, I promise to buy this house, I just have to get the money together first, then you have to put this money forward and you don't get it back. But it will go towards the house sale if and when you do purchase a house.
One fee that I can't quite wrap my mind around, because I don't really understand it, is some of these comunes, some of these communities which have the 1 euro house, require you to pay a 5,000 euro fee to the town. And I don't know if that will be lumped in with the entire payment that you make on the house, or if that's in addition to the house payment. But I do think that is something you will obviously find out once you contact the community to purchase the house that you want to purchase.
And it seems like too, and just we recommend this a lot with anything that is financial or legal in Italy, but it's not a bad idea to find a lawyer for a lot of this.
Definitely.
We talked about this in the student visa one. If you can find an immigration lawyer to really help you through the ins and outs, we're going to talk about this on a work visa one for sure. But anything that includes any type of residency or any type of legal thing, a lawyer does help because they're better at finagling than you will be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And they're better at understanding the legalese and the bureaucracy and paperwork and such that you will definitely have to go through.
Absolutely. And the reason I mentioned that is especially because there are some other fees. Some towns have their own fees. The notary, like I mentioned, has that fee, but also from what I found, you are required to translate that document into English. It doesn't matter if you're going to trust the notary and the town. If you're like, no, it's fine. It's in Italian. I don't mind. I'm just going to sign it anyway. They're like, I don't care. It needs to be in English because we can't be, we don't want to be in a court case of 2 years from now that you said, well, the document was in Italian. I couldn't understand it. So blah, blah, blah. So they do require that you translate it into Italian, which means there are a couple thousand certified translators in Italy that are certified by courts as well as by the state to translate official documents. And I think they do it, and then they have to hand it to a judge, and the judge has to, basically it's all the whole under threat of law. They have to make sure, they promise that whatever's in the translation is done by
An official person.
By an official person, exactly. So that also costs another couple hundred to to 1,000 and change, depending how long, because usually they charge per page. Sometimes it's per project. It depends.
And sometimes it depends on what's required. Like, I think depending on what you need, they don't always have to take it officially to a judge, but some paperwork, they do have to physically go to a judge in person and exchange this paperwork and bring it back to you.
So it's a bit of a headache for everybody involved.
Yeah.
So that, I think, would that pretty much covers the fees, or are there more fees attached to this?
No, I think that pretty much covers the fees.
So I think just for those of you following along at home, it essentially means let's say you get this house at €1, you're going to pay a minimum of 1,000 for the notary. And again, let's just say you pay $2,000 to promise you're going to buy the house. You're at €3,001. Let's say it's another 1,000 to translate, so €4,001. And that does not include the fact that you're going to have to pay a minimum, give or take, of, let's just say, bare amount, €20,000 to renovate. So you're looking at €24,001 to buy a €1 house. That's if you were the only one at auction. If it's more, it's more, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good roundup. And
a little nutshelling there.
Yeah. So do you want to, should we go into how to apply for these houses, or do you want to kind of compare that cost to what it would be if you were just buying an inexpensive house in a small town?
I think let's do that one first. Let's talk about the regular style of purchasing a house.
Okay. Classic style.
Classic style.
So houses here in the town where we are that need renovation but are not falling apart are selling for, what do you think, around 10, 20,000?
Yeah, I think it's about fair. Yeah.
Okay. So, and your example number for the €1 house just now was around 25,000 with all of those fees.
And I think so. One good way to think about this, though, is some of those fees are immutable in terms of you can't do anything about them, right?
Immutable.
You heard it the other day. I was like, I got to use that in conversation, and now I am. And some of them you really can't do anything about. They're a fact of life. Some of them do change. If you are someone who is trying to get a residency visa, or you already have one, if you want to get a student visa or a work visa, digital nomad visa, then actually it becomes a lot cheaper to buy a house by a couple percent, because you are paying, I think it's 9% tax on a house if you are not living in Italy or not a resident and just buying it as a second home, because you can't buy a house here as a first home if you're not obviously a resident. Mm-hmm. And then it's like 2% if you're buying it as a primary home.
Wow.
So
okay.
if you're paying money for a house, if you're anything like $100,000 for a house, it's a pretty decent savings. So that's something definitely to consider. But we should have also mentioned this at the very beginning of the episode. I realized that, yes, a foreigner can buy a house in Italy. There's no restriction in law against foreigners buying property in Italy. It's very much anybody can. However, and I really should have mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, there is no, golden visa that applies to a house purchase.
Yes, buying a home does not guarantee you citizenship or residency. So that's a really good point. So speaking of HGTV earlier, often House Hunters International, people will buy houses in Italy and act like this is going to be their full-time residence as Americans, without having a residency here or a dual citizenship or anything like that. So if you buy a house here as an American with a regular tourist visa, you can only spend 3 months at a time here in your house.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind for those of you, again, playing along at home and trying to figure out how this works. And so, yes. So in the sense that there's about, let's just say, an arguable 5,000 is a good number of legal fees that you cannot do anything about. Mm-hmm. So a €1 house, let's say, starts at €1, and then any other house starts at whatever price it is, and then you add 5,000 on top of it. But there is a break-even price, because if you have to add 20 grand on top of renovation fees on a €1 house, and you can find a house cheaper than 20,000, then it's cheaper typically to buy a house ready to go, especially if it doesn't need as much renovation. I think my mom's house is a good example. Her house, I think, is only 11, plus it was, I think, 5 or 6 for the garage, plus it was a couple, like 3, I think, give or take, for the land.
Mm-hmm. And just as an example, I think we've explained your mom's house before, but her house and her garage are not connected, and neither of those are connected to her land.
Yes.
So it's not like they were just nickel and diming her on this house that was entirely connected to
it's a really
garden.
Good point. Yeah. It's no, the land is on a mountainside near the town, and then the garage is near a parking lot, but it's a very small town, and a garage is a very valuable space in a small town, and not unlike New York City, a very big town. And so the house itself wasn't, that much, and it was pretty much, I would never say turnkey. and I don't think anybody would, but
You could shelter in it, and it had electricity and water.
it had electricity and water. It was 2 stories. The floors were fine. It doesn't have a kitchen. It didn't have a kitchen. She put in a kitchen, but it did have a bathroom. So, I mean, it was one of those things where, I mean, the doors closed. All the doors had glass in it. It wasn't like somebody, broke all the doors. All the little taparella, which is those little rolling shutters, worked fine. There was a balcony. So it was very much in a livable state.
Mm-hmm.
And
At a certain point, she did have to have the roof redone in a certain way, but not immediately.
And then, of course, the plumbing was from the 50s. And so it did find the pipe did give away at one point, and they had to tear out the entire bathroom and put a new pipe. So that was a bit of a bummer. And that is unfortunately one of those things that a good plumber and a good architect or an engineer, somebody because you really don't, if you're going to go house hunting in Italy, you want to bring somebody who knows what they're talking about. Because I think, as for me personally, like I'm somebody that when I see like the Tarly signs in the wood beam, like where it's like, oh, it's been eaten away, I'm like, I don't want to live in a place that the beams have already been eaten away. And a lot of architects are like, oh, no, that's fine. That's not a problem. But what they look for is like signs of rust in the wall that might be like a pipe has burst, or, there's other things to look for.
Or what is the point at which the Tarly have reached? Is it a point where you can exterminate the Tarly and the integrity of that beam is totally fine? If it's completely eaten through, though, they're going to let you know.
Oh, yes. No, they'll let you know if it's dangerous, but there's a very much like I think I look for different things.
And given, so your mom's partner is an architect, and he will notice things like, based on where the kitchen sink is and where I've seen that, with our house, the kitchen sink plumbing lets out into the toilet from the 1950s and the floor below. And I mean, obviously,
it's hilariously broken.
We as non-architects did see that as a problem. However, he can look at the kitchen sink and go, okay, I know where that lets out in the bottom floor, and I know where that connects to the upper floor, and I know what this thing leaking out of the wall is because that's connected likely to this thing. And so there are a lot of technical things that he can see that you and I don't think would have noticed.
Well, and the same thing I think with when you talk about renovating a bathroom, you'll notice, not you, Darcy, but you, our dear listener, if you happen to go, not even house hunting, if you happen to visit Italy and you happen to stay like an Airbnb or some sort of a friend's house, and you're under, like, why is the bathroom like up a step? Like, why do I have to go up, 6 inches to get into the bathroom? And it's because it used to just be a room. And when they put in a toilet and a drain, essentially, they had to have a slant. And without a slant, then it just...
For the tubing.
For the tubing, exactly. So all of them have, almost all bathrooms that were added into houses that are not original. So basically, anytime they added in a bathroom post 1950s, they had to add a slant. So which means they had to literally put lift the bathroom up. So that's just, again, yet another little tiny problem. But with my mom's house, it wasn't that bad. And that's not like outside the realm of possibility in terms of, like, we were just shown a house the other day that they would, basically want to sell for anywhere between 8,000 and 10,000. It's a couple bedrooms. It's a couple main rooms. It's got a fireplace. It's got an attic. It's a house.
It's got one weird floor, which Darcy can stand up in, but Nathaniel can't because the
I've
ceilings are
forgot about that.
About 5'6".
Yeah, it's got like they had this like 20-foot ceiling space, so they tried to do like a little secondary floor, but they made one floor like 5'6" and the other floor like 15 feet. So rather than just make them both 10 feet, so it's a little bit weird.
But it worked. The woman who was showing us her house, it was her grandmother's house, I think, and she was saying that was the floor where her grandmother would do much of the cooking. I'm like, oh yeah, your grandma was probably about my size or shorter, so it worked.
Yeah, Darcy
for her.
had no problem in this floor. Nathaniel had
also,
tons of problems.
I don't know how to describe this to y'all, but so you enter. I love this house. That's why I want to explain it. So you enter on one floor, and it's just normal height of a regular floor of a house, and you go through the little entryway in the living room, and then you come to sort of a kitchen area, and then the woman showing us the house goes, so let's go down to the next level. You have to essentially, it's not a hole that you crawl through, but it's
very close to a hole.
It's a lot like spelunking, and it's a very steep stairwell that you spelunk down to that, and it is a little curvy thing, and you curve down the stairwell into that tiny floor, and then past the very short floor, you go further down some stairs, which are less like spelunking, but very steep cave-like stairs, and then you end up in a very tall ceilinged, what it was used for, like
deposito.
Deposito, thank you, for wine and for wood and all that, and for animals. So it was like a cave house with also regular rooms. It was wild.
I think actually for me, the biggest takeaway was in the kitchen, because that's how you enter the downstairs, is essentially there is a hole 2 feet by 2 feet that in that 2 feet, you have to go down about 4 feet. So you have to essentially, your first step down is 2 feet and your next step down is 2 feet, which I'm not entirely sure how anybody is supposed to do that without long legs.
This little grandma who did her cooking
Like,
and then
frequently
came
did
up
this,
those
yeah.
stairs every day.
But I guess like the biggest thing is just like, I often just walk around a place without realizing where I'm walking, you know, like I'm just
Yes,
like, oh,
you
I might
do.
stumble and fall.
You would
And
fall in that hole all the time.
I would have multiple broken legs. I'd break a leg while it's still broken. I mean,
And
it
then
would
you'd
be,
hit your head on all the
Oh, it would be-
beams and, rocks sticking
yeah,
out.
I'd be the story of like why you can't trust somebody in their house. I mean, I would be on the nightly news. It'd be horrific. They'd be like, this guy slipped multiple times in a very short space. Like, it would look like murder, but it wouldn't be. So I'm not entirely sure who lives there. And the point is, they were trying to sell it to us for a very, very, very fair price, in the sense that it had recently been lived in a couple years ago. Some of the stuff had been renovated, like the windows were double paned. The like one area, it was clear that one floor was recently, like literally in the last 10 years, renovated, and the rest of it was like okay. Like it still had the original concrete floor upstairs where there's no rebar or anything, so like it's a little shaky at the best of times. When two people are walking across it, you're like, oh, this is shaking way too much.
Yeah, you and I, if we had bought that house, would have needed to renovate the floors.
Yeah. But there are other places we've seen that are like 8 bedrooms, couple, 2 different kitchens, et cetera, that are only like $40,000. So this is all to say, if you were looking to buy a house, while the €1 houses are a really amazing option in terms of availability and in terms of intrigue, it's only a great option if you 100% have money to renovate and you don't mind that renovation cost. And some people too, I've read some of these articles where they put 200,000 or 300,000 into it, and like it was so cheap, and I'm like, okay, right, no, I get that, but if I came into the store because it was $1 beer, and then you get to the beer place and it's like, well, after taxes, only $300,000. I'm like,
Right.
well, that's not $1 beer. That's $300,000 beer. I don't want that. I want the $1. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of like, it seems like it's great for people who are like, again, in the States trying to buy their first house, and they're like, I just cannot scrape together. Because again, we should mention too, there's no mortgages that you can apply for in Italy as a non-Italian. And even as an Italian, it's going to be very difficult to get a mortgage because you have to basically have a job and have some sort of a history, because there's no credit score. So you have to essentially prove that you're willing to pay it back in some other way. And it requires a parent or somebody in your family who has already taken out a loan and paid it back to co-sign for you. But we know as 2 Americans, there's no way to get a mortgage here. So it all has to come out of your own pocket, which is a hefty sum.
It is, yeah. But I think, like you're saying, if you're someone in the U.S. and you want to buy a second home and you've saved up 20 or 40,000, I think you can very easily buy just a house, a regular
Absolutely,
house,
yeah.
regular classic style in a small town in Italy. I don't think you have to go through the €1 program, even though it is pretty flashy and cool sounding. And in my opinion, it also may come with not a built-in expat community, but I believe that this program is targeting Americans and people from the UK specifically. And so eventually you might get an expat community that has been built in your town essentially because of this program. So if that's something that you're looking for, that could be a fun risk you take,
Absolutely.
But you don't have to get a €1 house.
And actually on that note, and as a very last note, it's for those of you who have a little bit of money at the start, but don't necessarily have a lot of money to continue, you obviously don't have to renovate the house as soon as you buy it like you do with the €1 houses. So that means we have a couple of friends who have done this. They put $40,000 into a house, and then it's theirs. You can just, have the house. And when you get a bonus at work, or you save up a little money and you're like, yeah, I want to do a new roof. I don't want to do this. I want to do that. I want to, in the summer, go there and check on the work to make sure it's happening kind of thing. You can do that, and it can be a long-term project that is not beholden to any sort of comune or bureaucratic timeline. So if it's less pressure. So if you're like, I actually do have 20 grand and I cannot afford to buy a house for 20 grand in the States, because that's an insane amount of money to buy a house in the States for, you can do that in Italy. So you can basically purchase a house, and then whenever you have some money, toss in a washer or a kitchen or whatever it is as you slowly kind of build it up. And then, you can spend time in the summer or in the winter and slowly make it accommodating to your needs, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's a really doable plan for a lot of people.
That's what it seems like, especially you mentioned that second home for expats, especially.
Yeah, exactly. And one other fun thing for expats, and really kind of if you just want to try out living in Italy, there's this really cool opportunity that I found today. And it's not a part of the €1 house program, but it is sort of based on that idea. So in this town called Olalai, which is a great name,
Absolutely amazing.
and
Yeah.
I believe it's in Sardinia.
It is pretty much smack dab in the middle of Sardinia. Like if there's a middle, it's there. It's the Kansas of Sardinia.
So
Because I'm pretty sure if you balance like the United States on a pin or whatever, Kansas in the middle, that's Sardinia.
I love that. So it does seem like a very cute little town, and they have this cool program that it seems like they've just started, and you can rent for up to a month a home for €1, which is very cool. And they're really looking for people to come and sort of enhance the town and do like a community exchange. So they particularly have mentioned artists and writers and scientists and engineers. I think one option they were explaining, like, what are you going to do when you come here? Well, if you're a PR manager, you can come and talk to people about PR. And
Amazing.
I know.
I love like we have a PR problem, but then they just like the last person that came was a person because they left him with this banger of a quote.
This is on the Comune, the official Comune website. It's on the homepage,
Yeah.
I think? Okay. Quote, want to leave the United States after Trump's victory? And then it goes on to say, come visit Olalai.
Kind of amazing. And I think that was posted in November, like the late November of 2024.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's like a reused quote from 2016 or if it's just a 2024 original.
I don't know, but I love it.
Yeah, it's a global election in many ways.
So for this thing, just like the others, you have to apply through the Comune, and they will, in this instance, they'll link you up with a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom home, depending on how many you need. And it's a person's home. They're very insistent that it's not a B&B, it's not an Airbnb, it's not a hotel. You will be living like a regular person in Olalai for €1 for the month. And you do have to, it seems like, promise to do a lecture or lessons or just interact with the community relating to your profession and the reason that you're going there.
And if you're antisocial, do not have any fears. This is Italy. So oftentimes it means giving a lecture in English to a group of people who do not speak English, and there'll be 8 of them there,
Yeah.
and they're going to clap politely, and somebody will translate some questions from the group, and it's always a nightmare. It's always, they try, like everybody here tries, and I love that they try.
Do expect chaos.
Yes.
Please don't come thinking that you are going to present your profession in a very like clean, wonderful, modern space to a lecture,
Not
like
at
a
all,
college
yes.
lecture. No, it's going to be a community room, probably at the
Municipio,
municipio,
yeah.
which is like the
City hall.
courthouse, city hall. There,
Sometimes
like
it's in a
Nathaniel
church
said,
so they can requisition a church and do it there.
there's probably going to be 8 people there. Someone brought some snacks.
And also weirdly a cake or torte for no unbelievable
Always
reason.
sweets.
Yeah.
And like Nathaniel said, they're going to clap politely, but they might not have any idea what you're talking about.
But they will be there and they'll be enthusiastic and they'll eat the food and drink the drinks and they'll leave and they're like, that was fun. So if you're antisocial and you're like, I don't want to talk, it's just like talking in front of a bunch of cats in the sense that they don't understand what you say. Not that Sardinians are anything like cats.
No, but Nathaniel loves cats, so that's a compliment. You're not,
I really do like cats. I'm not smack
I feel
talking
like that would be a
Sardinians.
dream for you if you could just talk to a room
Yeah.
full of cats.
A lecture in front of cats.
Yeah.
So, and I think that the last fun little note is before you get into, we're gonna end it with how to apply. And I wanted to not jump in. I wanted to scoot in and just say for those of you who are like also like who have listened to this entire episode and you're just like, this is kind of a great idea. Like I have 100,000 euros. I have no problem with paying for the renovations. This is a dream come true for me. Where do I sign up? But the only question you have is on taxes. There are only 2 sort of perpetual taxes that you will have to pay. One is your just the regular old property taxes. It is like we talked about before, it is a portion of the what the Comune says is the cost of the house, not what you say or a real estate agent says is the cost of the house. You pay, I think, every June and December. And then there is a waste tax. So there's a tax, I think, because I think everywhere. I don't know if there's a private, like, I don't know. In the States, I know sometimes like in an unassociated community or disassociated community, what is that called? The unincorporated community. So
Disassociate.
the community is disassociating out
I
there.
want to be part of a disassociated community.
like sometimes they have to go private with their trash
Yeah.
and they have to take all these bids and blah, 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 blah. But in Italy, I believe every town does the comune does all the trash, the recycling, the trash, the not umido, the compost. And you pay a waste tax every year, basically every month or every year. And it is scales based on how many people are living in that house. So it is something I do urge you, if you do buy a house, to pretty much immediately make sure that it only has whoever's living in that house. Because sometimes, like, some of these taxes don't get changed after a house sale. Like, for instance, my mom still pays this like 19 euros a year for a TV tax. And I'm like, just call them and say you don't have a TV. She's like, it's too much. I'm paying 19 euros to never talk to these people in my life. It's a great deal. So, and unfortunately, sometimes you will buy a house and it like had 8 people living in there and now it's just you, but you're paying waste as if 8 people live there, and just nobody's bothering to change it because you haven't made a petition to change it. So that is just something to keep in mind.
Also on trash, if you're going to be doing construction, the construction company knows not to do this, but just for you, you cannot dispose of construction materials in your regular trash. I believe we're pretty on top of that in the US, but I know that there are people who throw away like plaster walls or the, drywall. If you do a light renovation project,
But nobody
you chuck
that we know.
you chuck that drywall in your regular trash, nobody's going to bother you. But here, you at least in our neck of the woods, you cannot dispose of construction materials in your regular trash. You will be fined.
Yes. So they'll put it in a dumpster, they'll take it away, and then in a week or two, when you're on a nice walk through beautiful countryside nature, you're like, wait a second, that pile of trash over there looks mighty familiar. And you'll go closer and you'll find out that, yes, that is the chipped toilet seat that they took from your house, and with a pile of tiles and some random debris.
I don't think that's construction companies that do that. That's regular people who are renovating their homes who do that.
Our neighbor has often frequented that. If you're going to take away tile, he's like, just dump it in the stream. He's like, it's tile. What's the worst that could happen?
I hate that.
So, and he does this professionally. So
Okay, so that's a good example of a bad example.
it's a great example of a bad example. So how do I apply for this? If I'm just fired up, if this episode has just made me so pumped to buy a house, how would I do it?
Okay, first things first, I think that speaking to you, Nathaniel, we should put a couple of links in the description, just quick links of, houses that are available. Idealista has a great list for 2025, and another...
I think it's called oneeurohouse.com.
Yes, they have a great list that seem to be updated pretty frequently. So we'll put those in the description so you can find these easily. And once you find the one that you like or the town that you like, you will go to the Comune website. So that's the official city website, essentially. And sometimes they will have like an application page. Other times they will just say, contact us. So you contact them, say what you're interested in, and essentially you'll go through an application process through that specific community, not through, Italy entire.
Right.
And then there's a limited window for all of these places. So like Sambuca di Sicilia, I don't think they have an open window right now for applying to buy a house there. So you may find one that you like, but if this is a plan for the future, you might not be able to get into that specific community that you're looking at today. It's a tight window for when you can apply.
I was gonna say, yeah, if it's a plan for today, you might have to find a different town, kind of thing. So that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think that's pretty much it.
And to answer the question at the very top of this episode, which was, Darcy, can I buy a house in Italy for €1?
Yes, and ...
I would say almost no, and definitely not. Only because it's, I think even if you bought the house for €1, there's
You're
no way
still going to pay more.
There's no way to get around the fees.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, I would say there's no way to buy a house in Italy for €1, at least through this scheme. And even if you knew all the people, if you knew the notary and you knew the person at the comune and the blah, 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 there are still some federal fees / judge fees that you just simply cannot get out of.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I would unfortunately say what we've learned today, this Mythbusters episode, is that no, you cannot buy a house in Italy for €1. Myth busted. And then I went like that little...
Yeah, absolutely.
then-
What's that? Snopes does the...
Snopes. Yeah, this fact checker.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
Snopes says-
flaming hot or whatever
No.
it is. Yeah. I don't. They have that little fun gauge, pants on fire. So thank you all so much for coming back to today's episode, or coming to today's episode. If this is the first you've heard of us, it's a fun episode for you to first join us. And we hope that it's enough that you want to stick around and subscribe or follow us.
And come to Italy.
And come to Italy.
Come buy a house. Or don't. Just come visit.
Absolutely. There's a lot of them. There's a ton of houses. We would know that for a fact. We don't own any of them, but we know that they're there.
They exist.
And I actually, if I may say one last thing, as a very, very last thing, whoever's about to get off their headphones and be like, oh my God, one more thing, I have to hear this. I do apologize. If you are actually looking to buy a house, just as a heads up, it seems to be kind of split, but the North tends to put more online than the South. So I say that if you're looking at these 1 year house towns, basically, it's silly, but if you go to like Idealista, Immobiliare, which again, like I mentioned in the last episode, it's Zillow of Italy, you might notice that nothing's for sale. And you're like, how is nothing for sale in this town that has 8 houses for €1? It's because it's a mix of things. But one, a lot of people have a distrust of the internet. I think a general thing, especially people who are a little older, have no trust in the internet. They still have like satellites pointed at radio stations, which again, makes total sense. Let's be honest, this is not a good time to go trusting the internet. So unfortunately, and there's also that sort of, especially in the South, there is a natural suspicion, and it's just like we've talked about in the house sitting episode. Sometimes people like not want house sitters in their house because like, I don't want strangers in my house touching my things. A lot of people do not want to upload pictures of their house on the internet. They're like, I don't know, you're going to scam me somehow. I don't want that. So all that being said is there's so much for sale in the South. Like our town is half for sale practically. And there might be 6 houses for sale online, and they are for ridiculous sums of money, like absolutely untouched to reality sums of money. Like you are not getting a house for 585,000 euros in a place where the house next door in better condition sold for like 28,000 euros. So it's a little bit like, it's clearly somebody's kid in Milan is like, oh, that's a house cost. And it's like, yeah, in Milan, not in the middle of nowhere where nobody ever visits and you cannot find on a map. So all that being said is, if you're house hunting and you cannot seem to figure out why there's nothing available online, unfortunately, it does mean a lot of these things are available only in person. And that usually means going there in person and calling the number. But if you want to be a little sneaky about it, you can just use Google Maps, because those signs that say Vendici have been up for like 15 years. Yeah. So their number is probably still good. So that is just all to say, if you're in Italy and you're wandering around, yeah, call some numbers, see what's for sale. And even like in places like Rome, I think that's still valid information. Not everything's available online. Still, some things are only person to person because a lot of people don't trust anything except the person in front of them, which I think is very fair.
Yeah, it's just how they do it.
So yeah, I think that's everything. I think I've finally done.
Okay. So thank you to everybody for listening. If you have any questions, you can reach us on Instagram at onlyabagpodcast. You can send us an email, onlyabagpodcast@gmail.com. You can also have a look at our website, onlyabag.com, which hopefully very soon will be new and improved. And send us questions, comments, concerns, cute pictures of your pets, whatever you want to do.
Absolutely. And with all that being said, thank you all so much for listening. We truly appreciate it, and we hope to have you back, your ears back, for the next episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I really messed that up. Whew.
But it was so good.
I was going for it. Tanti abbracci.